time during what's an incredibly busy time for all of us working in this space to participate in this important training. Today's training is being hosted by the Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness and being facilitated by Ed Mercurio Sacqua with Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse. So before we get started, a few quick webinar housekeeping rules. You'll be muted throughout the presentation. Please submit any questions that you have using the questions and answer feature in your Zoom app. That quick Q&A feature will show in your Zoom toolbar, which should either be hovering at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your own configuration of the Zoom application or web browser. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation primarily. As questions come up that integrate directly into the presentation, Ed will be trying to field those and build them in. Any other questions we will answer at the end. There's some time reserved there. If we do run short on time and we don't get to your question, Ed has graciously agreed to reach out to folks individually and respond to any questions that we can't cover during our 90 minutes today. We know there's an incredible amount of information and many questions that you may have and a 90 minutes time frame. We want to get everyone back to their regular workday on time. Then an important note here, today's presentation is being recorded. It will be made available in the Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness training site by the end of the month. So the presentation itself will be available, and then the slide deck from the presentation will be included in the learning management system, so that training site, along with the actual training, so that anyone who registers for the training can download the slide deck there. We're not just sharing the slide deck with all attendees directly after the training. We know that domestic violence is a really important issue to participate in true training about. And so we want to make sure that anyone who is reviewing the slide deck has also participated in the training series. Another important note about recording today, because today's topic is sensitive and really highly confidential as we think about people's experiences of domestic abuse, we do ask that any questions that you ask, that those really be framed from a place of understanding and service provision and not specific scenarios. So if you have questions about very specific scenarios or how to help someone you're working with related to their particular issue, that would be something to reach out to Emerge directly about. We want to make sure that in a recorded training, we're not including, we're not sharing anything that could jeopardize someone's safety or their confidentiality by describing an individual's experiences directly. Then lastly, if you're having audio or video difficulties, we know this comes up in the age of web-based training delivery. Please first try to log out of the training and log back in. If that is still not working, then you can go ahead and contact Austin Puka. You see Austin here. So if you're able to use the chat feature and that's functioning, you can certainly put that question in the chat. Austin is monitoring that. But we also know that often if you're experiencing technical difficulties with Zoom, you may not be able to use the chat feature. And so we've included Austin's email address and phone number here. This is a direct line so that you can reach Austin during the presentation if you need help sorting any of the AV issues. And Austin, if you would be willing to also put your email and phone number in the chat box, that will allow an opportunity for folks to jot that down in case they need it. So then, and I'm going to begin, oh no, I'm sorry, recording has already begun. So then to get us started, first today's sponsors. So as I mentioned, the training is being hosted by the Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness. We are a coalition of government, agencies, nonprofit organizations, businesses, and community volunteers working together to prevent and end homelessness in Tucson and throughout Pima County. As I look at the participants list, I know many of you are deeply involved in the work of the Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness. However, if you aren't familiar with TPCH and want to join us, please go ahead and visit our website at www.tpch.net. And then a bit about our presenting organization. So Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse is presenting today. Emerge is the only comprehensive domestic violence service provider in Pima County and the largest provider of domestic violence shelter services and education in Southern Arizona. Our community is incredibly fortunate to have such a great partner leading the work related to domestic abuse locally. And we're especially grateful to have Ed Mercurio-Sacua presenting with us today. Ed is the Chief Executive Officer at Emerge and an incredible advocate for people experiencing domestic abuse. Ed is also a member of the Continuum of Care Board with the Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness, and a great champion in aligning our work from aligning the work of domestic violence services and homelessness responses. We know that those are so deeply interconnected. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Ed begin his presentation. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Jason. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Wrong thing. All right, so thank you all so much for making the time to do this in the midst of all that you all have going on. We really appreciate the fact that you're dedicating time to learn more about this issue. We're going to try to make it useful time. Certainly thank you to TPCH, Jason, Austin, Brandy for making this possible and prioritizing this as a topic within the continuum of care. So as Jason said, I'm fortunate to be the CEO here at Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse. I've been working in the domestic violence field for about 15 years now. And nonetheless, I'm still going to be sharing really a 101 kind of level of introduction to the topic here today. We will hopefully be offering more of a 102 level deeper dive into this issue in the future. But this is going to stay a little more surface level, and there's still a ton to cover at the surface level. And so one of the things that we're going to try to do is get through a very complicated issue in a very short period of time. I will just say I'm going to be talking very fast, one, because I just tend to do that, but two, because it's really important that that we have the opportunity to get through as much as possible. So with that, I am going to jump in. And I think one of the things that's a little technical struggle for me here is making sure that I can keep tabs on what's going on in the chat while we're doing this, and just invite folks to kind of call out whatever kind of questions they might have so that we can monitor that along the way. And the team with TPCH will make sure that I have some visibility to that. With that, if everybody wants to go ahead and get into the chat to just share a little bit of who you are, to go ahead and add that that piece here. I'm going to go ahead and switch the screen that I'm sharing here just to maybe make it a little easier for me to see the chat. And in the meantime, if you would just drop into the chat your name and the organization you're with, so that everybody kind of knows who's here today. Great, thank you all. It's wonderful to see so many people here. And just to keep the timing flowing here, I'm going to go ahead and jump in as you all are continuing to put that in the chat there. Again, appreciate y'all introducing yourselves and for so many people being here today. Okay, so I think the very first thing, I mean, ultimately what we want to get to here is the ability to put the intersection together of how this issue of domestic violence might intersect with homeless services work, the work that you all do every day. There are certainly, domestic violence is so widespread that certainly all of you are working with folks who are experiencing domestic violence, and we want to make that connection. But before we talk about how this might look in terms of service provision to this population, want to start with some contextual pieces. So the very first thing that I want to do is just kind of talk about the scope of the issue itself. So first and foremost, we all know a victim of domestic violence. Every single one of us, I can guarantee that right now. We may not all know that we know somebody, but we do. And the reason I'm so confident in that is that 1 in 4 women will be victims of domestic violence at some point in their lives. So if you know at least 4 women, statistically speaking, you are very likely to know somebody who's suffered from this. I want to say right now, I'm speaking about women, not because men are not victims of domestic violence, and there are some statistics, albeit a little less clear around that, but certainly to say that men are absolutely victims of domestic violence. Women absolutely use abusive behaviors in relationships. Domestic violence takes place in same-sex relationships at the same rate, sometimes higher, even than in heterosexual relationships. So I want to be really clear that this takes place in all relationships. That said, we also have to be real about the fact this is much more of a male violence against women issue than anything else. And so you're going to hear me use pronouns that often refer to the abusive partner as he, the victim or survivor in the situation as she. And again, let me just say too, of course, there are people who are gender nonconforming who are in domestic violence relationships. So I ask for forgiveness of my use of the he and she pronouns simply as a simplification for our purposes today, not out of a lack of acknowledgement that those are not pronouns used by everybody, or lack of an acknowledgement that there are often abusive, the dynamics of who's the abusive partner can change in all relationships. But again, we do have to be real about the fact that the vast majority of this is male violence against women. Okay, that said, this can happen to anyone. It is often stereotypically thought to be something that happens more in low income communities, in certain racial groups. It is not. It is something that happens across all parts of our community. And we've got to be real about that. There are just as many acts of domestic violence that take place in the foothills as any other part of the community. I think it's also helpful. Numbers are limited in their help in talking about human issues, but one thing I think it helps with is the scope. So we at Emerge serve about 6,000 domestic violence survivors a year, and another 500 abusive partners a year. That 6,000, however, is the tip of the iceberg. And there's a couple of reasons that we know that. First and foremost, just the Pima County Sheriff's Department and TPD alone. That doesn't even include Marana, Sahuarita, Oro Valley Police Departments, some of the surrounding areas. Just TPD and the Sheriff's Department alone serve 15,000 911 calls for domestic violence alone every year. It's the primary call generator for law enforcement. What we also know from some research is that only about 1 in 10 cases of domestic violence even get reported. There's shame, there's fear, and we're going to talk a lot about that as we go on here, but all to say it is a highly underreported crime. And as we're also going to talk about, the vast majority of abusive behaviors are not illegal. It's not against the law to commit many acts of domestic violence, which means you can't call 911 for it. So those 15,000 calls are the tip of the iceberg. And if you start to kind of multiply out, if we're thinking 1 in 10, and we're also thinking that's just to identify the number of victims that exist, we also think about the abusive partner and their impact in the situation, the children in the home, friends and family members. All to say, it starts to quickly be clear that this is a massive epidemic within our community and all communities. Okay. And lastly, on kind of a statistical look at things, fatalities. Unfortunately, there are quite a bit. We usually see in a typical year in Pima County about 15 to 25 domestic violence related fatalities in a year. We have seen a couple here very recently in the past couple of weeks. And so it just helps anchor us and ground us in the realities of this issue. So then my question, kind of rhetorically and literally, is what is this thing of domestic violence? What does it look like? So I'm going to start by sharing a definition with you, and then I'm going to ask for some input in the chat about the particulars of how this might play out in relationships. So for us, we emerge focus on intimate partner violence, which is absolutely a subset of domestic abuse or domestic violence, particularly in the legal sense. So in a legal sense, we're talking about a familial or intimate partner relationship. So it's certainly inclusive of child abuse, when children are physically abusive towards parents, elder abuse, that is the full range of domestic abuse. But there are some very distinctive dynamics related to intimate partner violence, and that's really going to be the crux to what we're going to focus on today. At Emerge, we define that as a pattern of coercive behavior that includes the use of threats or violence and intimidation for the purpose of gaining power and control over another person. And it can look a lot of different ways. It can be physical, psychological, or mental, or verbal, sexual, economic, and we're going to dive into that a bit right now. But the bolded language here is the piece I want to draw your attention to, in that it isn't just a one-off act of violence. That is horrible too. That is dangerous too. That is unhealthy in any relationship too. But we're talking here about a pattern of behaviors, and it's a pattern for a purpose, and that purpose is gaining power and control. Again, there are other ways in which domestic violence or acts of violence might take place in the context of an intimate partner relationship. It includes people with mental health issues. It includes people with PTSD. It includes drug and alcohol use. There are those kinds of things that absolutely happen. And again, they're not okay, they're unhealthy, they're dangerous, but it's not exactly what we're talking about in terms of a dynamic of a pattern of coercive behaviors that may or may not be physical, all for the purpose of gaining control over another person. And that's a different kind of thing. So what I want to ask you is just to throw in the chat, when I say, what might this look like what are the concrete ways this might play out in a relationship? What are some things that come to mind for you? And just throw them in the chat so that everybody can kind of see that. Yep, absolutely. Various forms of physical abuse, financial piece, name calling, isolation for sure. Yeah, these are great. Keep them coming. Throw a couple more in there for me. A lot of financial pieces, absolutely. Yeah, who you can talk to. Forced pregnancies, yes, absolutely. These are all right on. These are all kinds of things that we see. And so I'm going to share with you a tool that we use as a way to kind of think about how to kind of frame all of this. Yeah, these are great things. Thank you all. Gaslighting for sure. So this tool, and you can keep them coming, but I'm going to move to this tool here. It's called the Power and Control Wheel. It was created in the 1980s. Basically, a group of victims kind of got together and started sharing stories about the forms of abuse that they were experiencing, and come to find out there was a lot of commonality. And one person would say, yeah, my abusive partner does such and such, and then another would say, oh my gosh, so does mine. And they started to find kind of groupings or similarities between some of the tactics used. And that word is really important in this field. Tactic. Everything that we're about to talk about is a tactic. It is a means to an end. And that's really important to keep in mind. If you think about tactic and kind of its military roots or context, it is a strategic means to a particular end. And it's really important that we keep that context in mind, that these are not just random acts of violence. They are not being done just because. They, back to the definition, they are being used to control another person. The thing about a tactic or a strategy is it's only useful if it produces the desired effect. If it gets people to do what you want them to do or stop doing what you don't want them to do. And so we often see in domestic abuse relationships that the tactic being used changes and morphs over time to continue to have the desired effect. So the power and control wheels you can see on the outside has a lot of the kind of things that we typically think of when we hear the term domestic violence. It's that physical abuse piece. A lot of you all touched on these things in the chat. The one thing I want to push out or point out is that it uses the term choking. I will just say for us, the use of terminology, the language we use is important. We personally, this is kind of a national, now global model. We prefer to use the term strangulation versus choking. Choking is something blocking your airway kind of outside of yourself. You choke on a piece of food. Strangulation is the intentional cutting off of somebody's airway, and that's what's happening here. So we try to make that distinction, but this is the kind of stuff that we know about. There's black eyes, there's broken arms, there's all kinds of physical injuries that take place. This is unfortunately where a lot of those fatalities come into play. There is a rape, including marital rape. There is, as was mentioned in the chat, forced pregnancies. There's all kinds of things that take place in that physical realm. And I think most of us can kind of just automatically wrap our heads around that a little bit as knowing that that takes place. It's these other 8, what I call pie pieces, kind of in the middle of the model here that I think get less attention. And that's unfortunate because in fact, the vast majority of domestic violence that takes place is the tactics in the middle of the circle here, not the outer rim. And it is often that the emotional kind of components here that take place are the predecessors to any physical abuse that takes place. Not true for every relationship by any means, but by and large. So we want to spend just a few minutes. I mean, we could spend a whole hour just talking about the power and control wheel, and we just simply don't have that time, unfortunately. But want to take, at least a few moments here to look at this. So, intimidation and threats. This is, and again, as I'm talking, just kind of maximize the use of our time here. Let's use the chat function and me running my mouth simultaneously here. Go ahead and throw in the chat if you can think of some ways that people might use intimidation or coercion and threats as a tactic to control their partner, to get them to do what they want them to do or stop doing what they don't want to do. What are some specific ways that might play out, or specific things that people might threaten, or ways they might use intimidation? Go ahead and throw that in the chat box. Absolutely, right on. And one of the things that I'm already seeing that you're going to start to see here is a lot of intersection with some of the other pie pieces. That a lot of the use of coercion and threats is related to threats around finances, threats around children, threats around further isolation, things of that nature. So these things that you're putting in there are all right on point. And let me just say that the reason this tactic is used so often is I don't ever have to lay hands on my partner to get her to do what I want her to do. If I can threaten to do something and that gets my desired effect, why do I ever have to actually follow through and do it? If I can intimidate her so she thinks I'm going to do something, if I punch a hole in the wall next to her head and tell her next time that's going to be her face, You think she's going to do what I want her to do? Yeah, there's probably a good chance of that. And I never had to touch her. I never had to leave a mark. And so it becomes, quite unfortunately, an effective tactic that people utilize. And you can imagine, if you've not personally experienced it, which I'm sure many in this group have, just statistically speaking, um, how impactful that is. To not only be threatened, to not only be intimidated, but to have it at the hands of somebody who says they love you and that you love. It's a very impactful kind of thing to have happen. Thank you all for continuing to put these things in the chat. They're right on point. I'm kind of moving around to the right here as we follow the circle. Isolation, another huge tactic, because if you think about it, one, sometimes it's like a geographic kind of isolation, people moving to communities where they don't, moving away and going to a new community where the partner, the victim in the situation doesn't know anybody, can be really isolating. Causing somebody to lose their job, where they might have a support system at that job, can be very isolating. But there's also the isolation, and I've seen it in the chat a couple of times, about controlling who you can spend time with. And the thing about isolation is it can be really overt. It can be really blatant to say, you may not go see this person. If you go see if you go hang out with your friends, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. But it doesn't even have to be that. It can be as simple as maybe I sulk every time my wife goes out with her friends. I get moody, I complain about it, I pout about having to make dinner for myself because she's going to be away. Like, it can be that. It could be the silent treatment. And I'm just going to say here, one of the things that we believe is that this is rooted in socialization. And unfortunately, we don't have time to get into that conversation. But I will say, all of us are receiving the same socialization around this. And I will say, certainly as a man, and how I've been socialized around what manhood is supposed to mean, tells me no different than any other man what it means to be in a relationship. And I will tell you, the tactic that I have to work really hard not to use is silence, the silent treatment. And I can tell you, it is absolutely an impactful tactic. And so these are the kinds of things that create isolation from happening. Psychological abuse. That's the verbal abuse, mental abuse, name calling. I often ask women in groups, how many of you have gone through life having not been called a bitch, a hoe, a whore? And I have yet to find one. I'm sure they're out there, but I have not yet to find one, including young women. I asked that of high school students, and still, already in life, they have not made it even to that point without being called a bitch, a hoe, a whore, something of that nature, the way that we degrade women in particular, and the way that that has impact on our ability to then control them in some ways, and through our objectification of them. But it's often mind games. It is, somebody brought up the term brainwashing, and it can get to that point of the kind of mental conditioning that comes by playing mind games with people. Minimizing and denying can be a form of mind games. It's a way to make them question themselves, to think, is that really what just happened to me? Which sometimes is taking away the greatest thing that you can from a survivor, which is just her grounding in a reality of what's happening to her. So that is a big piece. Again, we could spend an hour easily on this whole thing. I'm flying through it. I apologize, but just want to give you a brief exposure to the diversity of tactics that are used. It was talked a lot about in the chat. Using children is used in many, many ways, to include threatening to harm the children, threatening to take the children away, bring DCS into the picture. But often it's also sometimes getting the kids to be engaged in the abusive behaviors. Sometimes it is teaching the kids to also call her all kinds of names, to also degrade the mom, etc. So that's at play as well. Economic abuse. There is no better way sometimes to keep somebody trapped in an abusive relationship than to take away their financial independence and ability to make decisions about where they're going to be. And so that is used regularly, unfortunately. It includes everything from not allowing their partner to get a job to going to their work, causing a scene, or otherwise causing them to lose that job. Sometimes it's simply the abuse itself, including physical abuse, where the victim then doesn't go to work, has absences due to not wanting people to see the bruises or things of that nature. And that absenteeism is what causes them to lose their job, all of which creates financial dependence on that abusive partner. Because it's really good to say, hey, you should leave him, right until the other option is homelessness. And you all see that all the time. People who are homeless as a result of trying to flee domestic violence, but the prospect of that's what I have to do. I got to now go to a homeless shelter. I got to sleep in my car, whatever it may be, as an option to not be abused is a difficult place for people to be. And so, unfortunately, that gets used a lot. Sometimes, the person is working, but they have to turn their check over to their abusive partner, and maybe sometimes even get an allowance out of their own paycheck back from that abusive partner. Entitlement, that is often kind of centered around, again, just with the lens of male violence against women, not at the exclusion of the other forms of violence that take place in intimate partner relationships, is often a male supremacy kind of belief system. Men are, the king of the castle kind of concept, machismo, but that idea that somehow men are entitled to controlling women, that they're entitled to controlling their partner, that that they have a right to their bodies, etc. And certainly this could get into another whole conversation about intersectionality and the intersecting forms of oppression that take place with gender-based violence or with domestic violence, is the concept that often race plays a role. Citizenship status can play a role. There are other ways that people utilize being members of dominant groups against partners who may not be. So it might be the sense that I'm white and my partner is not. My partner is a woman of color, and the entitlement that I feel as a white man in that situation may play out and be utilized as a tactic within the relationship. Certainly, if there are same-sex relationships where that person is not out, that is a threat, and that might take place, that they threaten to out their partner, but also maybe a sense of entitlement. If there's a transgender partner in the situation, there might be a sense of entitlement that comes with being cis, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the power and control wheel. Again, lots to it, but I think the major takeaway here is that this is a way of understanding the diversity of tactics and that they are tactics. Okay, moving on. I just want to very quickly introduce you to the topic of the cycle of abuse. And I think this is where we're going to start to intersect with the service provision piece and how this might show up in your daily work. The cycle of abuse in a really quick nutshell here. And I'll also say this is not applicable to every relationship by any means, but it does exist in a whole lot of them. In a new relationship, that new partner can do no wrong. Everybody's in love. There's a rose-colored glasses to how we see new partners often, and it's often most relationships, the tactics where there is going to be a tactic used or there is going to be domestic violence, that does not come out necessarily at the beginning, that it looks all good. And then over time, like maybe something happens that's a little funky. You wouldn't even call it abusive at all. It's just a little funky. And you kind of make note of it, but then dismiss it and you move on. And everything's fine again. Everything's lovely. And then maybe something else happens. You're like, that was a little weird. That's kind of out of place for this relationship. But again, you might dismiss it or just kind of file it away, not make too big of a deal out of it. And again, you would never term it as abusive, and everything's fine again. But then often what happens is over a course of time, when that abusive partner is looking to gain control and maybe finds that it's not happening as naturally or easily as they'd like, then they might use a more overt tactic. And so all of a sudden, the victim in the situation, the survivor, is seeing something play out that, like, whoa, that's really wrong. I don't like what's happening here. Or they start to feel kind of what we might refer to as this tension building. And then there's something like that really happens that we're like, whoa, that is not okay. And maybe we even start to consider, wow, is that abusive? Or is that normal? I don't know. But then maybe there's an apology. So you're like, all right, cool. He said he was sorry. I'm going to move on. But then it happens again. Or maybe it's a little more noticeable or a little more violent or a little more clearly not what you want in this relationship. But there's these constant, what we call the honeymoon phase, where there's apologies or there's promises to get help, or there's excuses of, oh, I was just having a bad day at work. That's the only reason I did that. There might be some of that minimizing and denying of, no, that's not really what happened. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. It was just a little thing. No, that was an accident. Of course, I would never shove you down the stairs. I just slipped and ran into you. Any of those kinds of things. It might be time for flowers and chocolates. It might even be a time they go to start getting counseling. But it's all the things that basically say, stick with me, is going to be okay. And that cycle continues. Often, if we make that cycle 3D, it looks kind of like a funnel, because it is happening over and over and over. But each time, the circle is a little smaller because the length of time between the next tension building, the next act of abuse, is smaller and smaller. Again, that does not happen in every relationship by any means, but many times in domestic violence situations, it looks something like that. I think the point to take away from a service provision standpoint is to understand people are often caught in that cycle. These are people that that victim knows. It's not the stranger in the alley jumping out to hurt them. It's somebody they know. It's somebody they're invested in. It's somebody they love. It's somebody they might share children with. They've shared a life with. They want to believe that they're going to change. They want to believe it really was an accident and not on purpose. They want to believe they're going to get help and it's going to work. They want to believe all those things, and so they get stuck in that honeymoon period of, okay, it's going to be all right. That's why we see so many people leaving their abusive partner and going back. We see them leaving and coming into services. We start to work with them to help them get out of that abusive relationship, to maybe find independent housing, and then we see them go right back in with that abusive partner. It's not because they want to be abused. It's because of the cycle. They're caught in that cycle. And it's a really complicated, nuanced dynamic to work with somebody who's in that cycle. So it's just important to know that you might see that honeymoon period come up with people you're working with. And from your outside perspective, you're like, what the hell is wrong with this person? Why are they going back to them or allowing them to come live with them in the new housing now, or any of those different dynamics that might play out? And it's all, this is a piece of that answer, is that there is a cycle to this that takes place. So just wanted to kind of briefly bring that up. Okay, I am not going to spend a lot of time on this. Again, we're trying to, beat the clock here and cover so many things. But I did want to share this with you just for a moment. These are some of the very common, not an exhaustive list, of the emotional effects that a survivor might be struggling with when they're in an abusive relationship. And I'll just give you a second to kind of look at this list. The main thing I want to point out, I think, here is that, first of all, it's a lot. So it's going to look different for everybody. Not everybody's going to experience all the same things or all the things on this list, but it's a lot. that's something I think when we're working with survivors, it's important to remember these are the kinds of things they're dealing with. And sometimes they're able to articulate that this is what they're experiencing, this is what they're feeling, but not always can they even identify it, let alone articulate it to somebody else. The other reason I think it's important as service providers for us to keep in mind that this is what's going on inside of the heads of these folks is that, you know, imagine if you've got all this going on, how might that present itself externally to people? You're probably going to look like a mess because you are. Like you're going through a ton of things. It can come out really messy. Um, what we see a lot, particularly in law enforcement involvement or other kind of third party involvement with abusive couples that are in an abusive relationship, is that the person who's the victim has all this going on. This is going to come out sideways sometimes. It's going to come out messy sometimes. They're going to seem like they're not thinking right. They're going to seem like, wow, you can't put together like you can't share facts with me. You can't put together a nice chronological story of what took place. Meanwhile, their abusive partner, who doesn't have all this going on, looks like they're all put together. Like they can tell you a chronological story. They can tell you what appear to be fact. And so basically the bottom line to that is that the abusive partner seems believable and the victim does not. And that's a real shame, because what it means is often the abusive partner is not held accountable and the victim is not believed, which means they don't get the support from family members, from the system that we all work in as nonprofit human service providers, from the legal system. They're not believed because they don't seem credible, because some of these things here are kind of spilling out. And we don't take them into account and give that person the benefit of the doubt or help or try to understand where they're coming from. So I just put that out there, that a reminder that sometimes we work with folks who are really difficult to deal with. Let's just be honest. There are times we have people that we work with that are the easy ones, the ones that we want to work with, that seem grateful, that don't cause us problems, they're not cussing us out, like they're just the easy ones. And then there's those really difficult clients that let's again be honest, sometimes we don't want to work with. And I just want us to at least in the back of our heads, hopefully maybe a little more in the front of our heads, consider the impacts of trauma. These are among them. But the impacts of trauma from repeated acts of violence, repeated acts of manipulation and coercion, that if we had more time, we could go into the actual physiological and biological changes that take place in the brain as a result of trauma, let alone the emotional impacts of trauma. And then imagine, and also people are just in survival mode sometimes. Yeah, they might not come across not in a nice little box for us to deal with. It might be messy. It might be ugly. It might include people cussing us out and telling us, you know, why won't you help me when we think we're doing everything in the world for them? And why aren't they more grateful? This is something to keep in mind sometimes. So my question for you, if you don't mind throwing it in the chat box, is what are some of the reasons? I mean, we've touched on it a little bit, but if we think about it, why in the world would you stay in such a horrible thing? I've painted this really ugly picture of what domestic abuse looks like. Why in the world do people stay? Like, what's wrong with these people? Are they stupid? Do they want to be abused? Like, what in the world is wrong with them? Yeah, right on point, y'all. And as you're doing that, I'm gonna just add to the list here a little bit. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because y'all clearly get it based on everything that you're putting in the chat there. That's right on. Here's kind of a partial list. This is not mutually exclusive, but it's touching on the kinds of things that you all are sharing. What I want to point out mostly about this list and the things that you're bringing up, these are all very logical, rational, reasonable reasons as to why somebody might stay in such a horrible situation. And that's the main thing that I think we as a community, as a society, need to shift around our mindset when we talk about domestic violence. There is so much victim blaming that happens, and a lot of it is not explicitly said. It's more inferred. It's more in our belief system, whether we even say it out loud in any way or not. But somehow in the back corner of our mind, we collectively, not individually necessarily, but we collectively kind of believe they're asking for it. Because if they didn't want it, they would just leave. Because that's what I would do. If I was in that situation, I would just leave. I would tell him this, that, and the other, and I'd be gone. Well, maybe not, because these things here are very real and they are rational reasons to consider staying. That's the other part. It's not just the explanation of it, but they make sense if you think about it. It's not so easy to say, I'm going to take my kids away from their father. It's not so easy to say that, where am I going to go? And as wonderful as the homeless service provision, network is in this community, do you want to go stay in a shelter? I don't. Do I want to have to think about where I'm going to get my next meal? What happens when the shelters are full? Should I go sleep in the car if I'm fortunate enough to have one with my kids? When here, the refrigerator's full, the air conditioning's on in the summer, the heat's on in the winter, right? There's a lot to be considered in just leaving. And then there's all the emotional pieces. There is a sense of guilt because often they have been convinced that they are to blame for what's happening to them, that they're causing it. If they hadn't have said that thing, then he wouldn't have had to hit me. And if we also think about this relationship, may not be the first time they've experienced this, but other intimate partner relationships, maybe it's what they witnessed in their home growing up amongst their parents, amongst their friends' parents. There's a sense of normalization that takes place. This is just how it is in relationships. Leaving this one and going to another one will do me no good. It's going to be that way there too, because that's just how it is. So if it's normalized, you don't even know that this is wrong. You don't even know there's something to leave, let alone the thought it's going to do you any good. And so I think we got to remember that piece. We got to remember that there is often the intersectional forms of oppression that are taking place and the impacts that that has on people. Calling law enforcement is not the same for everybody. The idea of getting law enforcement involved as a way to help leave a relationship is not the same for a Black or trans victim as it is for a white victim. It is not the same for people in same-sex relationships as it is for people in heterosexual relationships. There are differences, and those intersectionality matters that impact people's decisions and ability to get help. The ability to be believed. And then there's pieces of, there's cultural or religious values that say, no, especially if you're married, once you're married, there's no getting out of it. You've made your bed, now lie in it, is often what they're going to get from outside of that relationship. So I just want to, and then there's the fear part that cannot be undersold here as a factor. Most domestic violence deaths happen when somebody is in the act of leaving or has already left, not while they're in the relationship. When that object of control is there, the sense that the abusive partner needs to use a tactic of control that extreme is often not there as compared to when that object of control has dared to leave them. and they feel like they're out of tactic options that are going to work. And so they often resort to that. All to say, there are often times, as twisted as this is, there are often times it is safer to stay than to leave. That is jacked up to say, but it is true. And if we keep that in mind, we are often less likely to victim blame or to judge that person for why they stay. It may absolutely be about their own safety or their children's safety. Because we often say, well, how could you let your children be exposed to this? You've got to get them out of it. But all of these very logical factors are still at play, including that it may be the safest way to keep their kids safe. Because leaving a situation, by the way, does not end the abuse. That abusive partner, especially if kids are involved, are still connected. But even if not, the level of stalking that takes place, following up and committing acts of violence after the partner is left, the only person who can stop the violence is the abusive partner, period. Law enforcement cannot stop it. Emerge cannot stop it. You cannot stop it. Friends and family cannot stop it. The victim cannot stop it. The only one that can stop the abusive behavior is the one who's engaged in the abusive behavior. That's a whole nother conversation about prevention work and working with the abusive partner. But being in the moment here, that leaving does not stop the violence necessarily. And only that victim knows their partner the best and knows what is going to be safest for them. So automatically saying leave, and us as service providers putting pressure on people to leave because we think that's the best thing for them, can be absolutely dangerous. It can be extraordinarily dangerous for us to try to think we know better and convince them to leave when maybe leaving is actually safest. Quite unfortunately, but quite true. Okay. We want to make sure that we can think about recognizing the signs of this, and then we're going to start transitioning into a more detailed look at excuse me, how this intersects with service provision. Unfortunately, there's no people don't wear a sign on their head that says, I'm a domestic violence victim or I'm experiencing domestic violence. There's a list here of some of the kinds of things that you can take a look for, but it is not to be assumed that these are the only signs of it. And these could be signs of many other things. Injuries. When my kids were little, they would go out in the street and with their friends and play and fall, and they'd come back with all kinds of cuts and scrapes and bruises. And I was, terrified to send them to school the next day, worried that their teacher was going to think they were abused. People do get injuries. Those things happen that are not the result of abuse. So we can't just say because somebody's got a bruise, oh my God, they're being abused. But at the same time, we have to be paying attention to that. It is a potential sign that something's wrong. How that person responds when we ask, inquire about, are they okay? Because we see that bruise there. How they respond to that may be where the signal is about whether that happened at somebody else's hands or not. Clothing inappropriate for the season. Somebody's wearing a turtleneck sweater in the summer in Tucson. Like maybe that's just an odd fashion choice. But it could be that they're covering up bruises from strangulation. It's hard to say. There's no just look down this checklist and you're going to know. But there are things for us to be paying attention to for sure. I think on this list of the most telling perhaps sign is really just if we go back to the power and control wheel and realize that the way that it's going to look, the types of tactics being used are going to differ widely. But all of it is rooted in power and control. So if we see signs of power and control being exerted by one partner toward another, whatever that may look like, without getting caught up in what those things are, but just saying, that looks like control, that's really our best bet at trying to identify if somebody is dealing with domestic violence or not. Now, what we do about it is really important, but first, just knowing, is this even an issue potentially for this person? That's what I would suggest, is kind of looking at, are there elements of fear, elements of control that are going on? and that kind of thing. When we think about then what to do about it, that's where it becomes a particular issue for any of us with people in our lives that might be dealing with domestic violence, but particularly in the context of service provision. So language matters. How we decide to talk to people about this matters. The reality is, as I said earlier, we don't know what's best for people. That's true across the board, particularly as it relates to domestic violence. They know their partner the best, they know their situation the best, they have figured out how to survive that long before we came into the picture, and they have found how to manage that situation. Not that that doesn't mean there's not room for us to provide education, support, resources, other options they may not have been aware of. But the point is, we don't know better than them. And the language that we use with them is really important. An example, if we use the term abuser, which has been a typical term that we've used for a very long time in the domestic violence field, which we at Emerge no longer use. We use abusive partner. What's the difference? Why does that matter? From our perspective, calling somebody an abuser, while absolutely appropriate in terms of a literal definition, starts to also dehumanize that person. And we can start to feel like, well, we should dehumanize them. They're a piece of crap. They're human garbage to do such a thing. To that victim, that's still their husband, their wife, their partner, their what have you. Like, that's their intimate partner that they actually still care about in many, many, many instances. And if we start to vilify somebody that they love, that somebody that they may want to continue to be in relationship with, because by the way, we serve way more people who are still in abusive relationships than who are out of it. And we serve way more people who still want to be in those relationships. They just want to be safe in them than we do with people who want to leave them. So if we keep that in mind, and that is their choice to make, and they're right, then the way we talk about their partner matters. And absolutely identifying the reality and the accountability and saying this is an abusive partner, yes, but to vilify them does us no good in establishing a relationship with that victim that we're working with. Considering and honoring survivors' lived experience. This takes place in many ways to include, again, the fact they survived life. They survived horrible things that some of us can only imagine long before they came to our agency. It is a real risk in the human services field to want to be their savior. And I'm here to tell you that's just not our role. We are not here to be anybody's savior. That there's presumptiveness in that we somehow there's a superiority that's actually underlying that. We know better than them. We can do better than they can have figured out to do, as opposed to they need somebody to lean on. They need somebody to listen to them, to support them, to go on the journey with them, to give them options and resources that they didn't know about or didn't have access to. But that's really different than we're going to fix you. That there's something wrong with you is what is implied in that. So honoring the fact that they have found a way to navigate these horrible things all on their own, through their own strength. And that if we start from a strengths-based approach of what they already can do, and as opposed to let us tell you how to be okay, there's a real difference there. But also, again, back to intersecting forms of oppression, honoring the lived experience and understanding that all domestic abuse is not created equal. I brought up the law enforcement example, but it plays out in many other ways. The reality is people of color, people who are transgender, people who are in same-sex relationships, have different experiences of being believed. They have different tactics used against them. And they are dealing with the dehumanization coming at them from many angles. So in addition to the dehumanization that might take place in that intimate partner relationship, they may also have the dehumanization taking place because of their race, because of their sexual orientation, because of their gender identity, because of their socioeconomic status, their citizenship status, etc. And so we just need to be aware and honor those things, and not look to provide cookie cutter services. There are different lived experiences, and our response to that should be as customized and as unique as their experiences are. People address abuse in ways that are comfortable and safe for them and make choices and decisions accordingly. That's, again, just simply respecting the fact that we don't know better than them in terms of the decisions that they're making, and that they are making decisions that they know they can live with, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that have to live with the consequences of whatever choices are made, not us. So we can preach all day long about all the things we think they need to do, and we get to go home to our lives, not theirs. There are often times that in the service provision arena, we experience what we might define as resistance, that this person just doesn't want to take the help that we're trying to offer. And there's many reasons for that, but sometimes we have found that simply listening to a person's story can help break down that resistance. And I'm not trying to tell you all things you don't know in terms of the provision of services in general, for sure, but simply just emphasizing that within the domestic violence world, in particular, in working with survivors of abuse and trauma victims, in particular, this idea of listening to their story can help people who have dealt with trauma start to take down some of the barriers that they have put up because of that trauma. There is a different layer, an additional element here when we're talking about trauma survivors that we're working with. The written standards that TPCH has put together kind of outline some basic steps to follow in terms of a non-victim services agency working with victims of abuse. So I'll certainly refer you to that versus spending a lot of time here, but simply to say, you don't have to be a victim services provider to do the basics, to understand some of this context that we're talking about today, to see the humanity in people, to provide some basic comfort to folks, to allowing them a private place to reach out to a place like Emerge, to not pressuring people to make decisions they don't want to make. Some of these basics of victim services are certainly things that you all, I'm sure, do all the time and can do as part of your service delivery. We do see, I will say, a fair amount of times where we will get calls from a victim who says, I'm working with such and such service provider. Sometimes it's in the homeless services field. A lot of times it's in the behavioral health field, where people are essentially told that they are needing to get help from Emerge, told that they are needing to get out of that relationship, go to a shelter, what have you. Sometimes it's actually the agency that is calling us and saying that this person needs to come into you. They need to come get your services. And puts us in a difficult spot, because, is that really what the survivor wants to do, or is that what the person at the agency thinks they should do? And I will tell you that 7, 8 times out of 10, once we talk to the survivor, they want something very different than what the service provider shared with us and said that person wants to do. So I just ask that, we all kind of keep that in mind, that we want to respect people's decisions of what they think is best for them. Something to keep in mind. And also something to keep in mind about Emerge. There's times we know that other service providers have been very unhappy with us because of the fact that we have not uh, um, sheltered them when they called asking for us to shelter them. And not realizing that when we got on the phone with the survivor told us they didn't want to be sheltered. That was not what they were looking for from us. And so just, something to keep in mind. We're always open to having that conversation between us as service providers to discuss. We can't share what a victim says in confidentiality, of course, but we can talk broadly about situations and make sure that we're all on the same page about what is this person really wanting from us. And then, there are times where the abusive partner and the victim are both homeless prior to the abuse starting or as a result of the abuse or what have you, and both might be getting services from you simultaneously or kind of independently of each other. And that's an important thing to keep in mind is how safe is it for that victim to really open up, to reach out for help when perhaps their partner is right there with them or that you are serving both, which can be very difficult. And we're always happy to talk through kind of brainstorm ways to deal with that as well when that comes up for you. I just want to acknowledge that there are some questions in the Q&A, and I will definitely try to leave a little time here to get to that at the end as well. There's some topics there that I think might take us a little bit off pace for where we're at right this moment, but really critical, important questions that are being asked there that I absolutely want to make sure that we get to. Because there's some talk in there about prevention, which is one of my favorite topics, but want to make sure that we get through the intervention piece first, just to make sure that you all have real tangible things to work with. Some questions in there about the intersecting forms of oppression. I'll just say real quickly about that there are some specific services. For instance, we have what we call the Queens Group, which is for Black or African descendant identified survivors, that they have a specific group, support group to talk about the impacts of domestic violence, but that are in the context of this additional layer of dynamic that they have in their lives that is different from other survivors. We do have hopes of creating some other kind of group specific spaces for people. We do partner with agencies like SAFE and others to connect people to services that might better meet their needs. But we try to make sure that our spaces are really informed about how to create a safe space for everybody. Certainly, again, more we could talk about there. And the question about how can you respect a person's abuse and differentiate between whether or not they really want help or are just using it as a ploy to get housed? I have that question asked to me many times, and I'll just quickly say, you don't. Somebody asked me the other day, well, how do what do you do to confirm that there's abuse survivors? We can't. There is no such thing as proof. We are not there in that relationship with them. We cannot know that. I will definitely say the existence of law enforcement involvement, a police report, is not the proof of that. If we believe somebody is using it to falsely gain services, they could also certainly make a false police report. But much more often what it is that people are scared to call the police for a variety of reasons, especially in communities of color, especially in communities where people have had bad experiences with law enforcement. So the abuse is not physical and it's not against the law, so they can't call the police. There's a number of reasons why law enforcement involvement cannot be the proof of abuse. So it really comes down to believing people. And it comes down to believing that there are far more people, we are far better off as a society believing people and getting the people who need services into services without judgment than we are of having the risk that people are playing the system. Not to say the latter doesn't happen. We tend to look at it as, if somebody's in such a difficult situation that they would pretend to be abused, which, by the way, I believe is done extraordinarily infrequently. I do not believe it is a major problem in our system. But to the extent that it occurs, if they are willing to do that, it's a survivorship thing. It's about they're trying to get housing, they're trying to get a roof over their head, they're trying to survive, and they figured out that maybe saying they're a domestic violence survivor is a way to help them do that. So not that it's right in that, you know, it utilizes services maybe meant specifically for survivors, but we understand these are people who also need help and need housing. So there's a little bit of a philosophical piece to this, but the reality is just that, yes, sometimes we're going to get people saying that they're abuse victims when they're not, but we're better off casting the wide net to make sure we don't miss people who really are, is my personal take on that. Okay, let's move forward here. Let's see. What to do or say. It's difficult. There are no perfect words. I think the main thing to think about is that silence, because you're worried about saying the wrong thing, is much more harmful than trying to say the right thing and maybe getting it a little wrong, maybe stumbling over that a little bit, maybe going back later and thinking, oops, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or oops, that sounded a little judgmental, or what have you. Yeah, we're gonna get it wrong sometimes, but saying something is better than saying nothing. And so that's, I think, an important piece to consider. If we think specifically about what's important to hone in on here, I think part of it is about just being concerned for them as human beings. I'm concerned for you, and I'm going to let you know that. If they deny the abuse, to, again, not question them, to not tell them they're wrong, but simply to say that if and when you ever feel the need, please know that I'm here. That is the most critical, for them to know that if and when the time is right, which it may never feel safe to divulge this information, but if and when they do, then they know there's somebody to go to. And that's critical, because if they feel there is nobody, they will often say nothing and just suffer through it. Telling them that you believe them can be huge, given the fact that so often victims are met with the belief that they're not telling the truth. They almost have to prove that they're telling the truth, and that's not just from people external, but from within their own families often. That takes place. So we want to be careful about that, to make sure they know it's not their fault, what's happening to them. That this is not okay, this is not normal. It might be normal in terms of what's typical for them. It is not normal in terms of what is right and okay. And then respecting their choices. I'm going to quickly touch on emerges services. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I just want y'all to know they exist. This is our 24/7 multilingual crisis hotline. It is answered by folks who are bilingual in English and Spanish, but we also have the use of language line for all other languages to make sure people can have access. We hope that you will use this information as you see fit. Very quickly, simply to say, there is a spectrum of services that we offer folks. There is this hotline, there's emergency shelter. We have 2 community-based offices, which are kind of like an outpatient equivalent. It's a non-residential service-based provision that includes case management and a million other things that I'm going to put up on the next slide, but also to say we have a very small housing program, some transitional housing and rapid rehousing. Yes, the area code is 520 for the hotline, thank you. And this is the range of services. I don't want to, again, spend a lot of time going into detail other than to say we've got a variety of things. So if you think somebody might be in need of services, please connect them to us and we can kind of go through and talk about their specific situation and what might be helpful to them, what they might be interested in, what might be a good fit. And if you as a service provider ever have a question, we are very happy to talk about that. We can certainly talk about our services in general. We can talk about even a particular case if we are using some generalities and talking, and we certainly cannot divulge and breach confidentiality. There are strict laws and ethical considerations around that, but we can talk broadly about situations and what might be helpful in support of a survivor. And then I just want to really directly address emergency shelter for survivors, because we get a lot of questions from people in the community, including amongst the homeless services field. And to be real blunt and transparent, we get a lot of people not so happy with us when it comes to shelter. And here's why. I think that there is often an expectation that because of how at risk survivors are, there is a broad expectation that, of course, those people are going to get the help they need when they need it. There's a broad expectation that when those folks need shelter as a way to flee domestic violence, they will have that available to them. I share that as a concept and a theory. Absolutely, they should have access to that, every one of them. And I'm also here to tell you there's a reality, and you all share the same reality. That reality is none of us have indefinite resources and therefore indefinite capacity to serve people. We do the very hard work, like you all do, of turning people away who need our help. It's horrible. It should not be. And yet it is. And we are no different in our limited budget, in our limited number of staff members, and our limited resources, and cannot take every single person, even if they need it, even though they deserve it. And so I just want to make sure, that you all know that we absolutely believe the same things about what should be. And that anytime that we have had to turn away somebody from what they have asked for from us, it is done with great pain and great regret that we cannot serve them too. That said, within the scopes of reality, we try to serve as many people as we can. We prioritize. It's an unfortunate reality of limited resources too, is that we have to prioritize, and the way we've chosen to do that, right or wrong, is to try to identify those at the greatest risk of lethality, serious injury or death. That is our first and foremost goal, is to stop people from being killed. And there are tools that we use. There are tools that we use, that law enforcement uses in conjunction with us as well, that we use outside of them, that are about assessing for lethality. These are evidence-based, research-driven tools to help us understand who's most at risk of death. It's not perfect, but it's a tool. And we try to prioritize services to those folks. We are focused on those with that acute crisis in front of them. And I'll be honest, again, it sometimes means people that fall outside of that are not able to access shelter services. So we try to then connect them with our non-shelter services, our community-based services, to make sure that they can still receive some form of support specific to the abuse that they're suffering. And we try to then focus on how we can help folks stabilize in whatever way that means for them, so that they can at least have that. It is completely inadequate. I will not question that at all. But it is our way to try to maximize the resources that we have. Okay, that's my spiel. So I want to make sure to address questions. I am checking out the chat and the Q&A piece here. I'll just quickly address and if there are other questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them. But to address the two questions that are there now about for abusive partners to change, what does prevention look like? First, I'll just say, I am more than happy. I would love to have a prevention conversation at some point, because there's a lot to dissect there about why people use abusive behaviors, and how that provides us with the key to how to maybe change that from happening. And for us as a victim services organization, changing the behaviors of the abusive partner is 100% about victim safety. The way we make her safer is to get him to stop being abusive. And again, I apologize for oversimplifying with pronouns and genders, but certainly within male violence against women, we're really looking at male socialization and things of that nature. So that's a great conversation to have. I will say, in terms of abusive, people using abusive behaviors, changing their behaviors, absolutely possible. Does it happen with everybody? Absolutely not. Many do not change that behavior, but many do. And not perfectly, not to the level that any of us would want, certainly not that their partner would want in all cases, but often it is better, safer than it was when we start to work with the underlying belief systems that we believe largely come from socialization, micro and macro, that lead to abusive behaviors. And we can start to change belief systems, which in turn drives behaviors and can make people safer. So yes, we have seen that change possible for sure, but it's like anything else. It works with some and not with others. It depends on the approach that's used. It depends on whether that person is open to help or not. It depends whether they've got a support system that will encourage the change or actively fight against it. There's a lot of dynamics there, but that's a piece of that. What else? What other kind of questions might folks have?
And so Ed, there are a few questions that have come in from the chat box. So the first, are there any books you would recommend written related to post-traumatic stress disorder that long-term survivors face?
I am terrible at reading. I'm just going to be totally transparent. You're not going to get book recommendations from me, unfortunately. But there are people who are capable of such things. And so I'm happy to try to pull together a list that we could share around that. Yeah.
Thanks. And if organizations would like DV information available, so I'm guessing Byron, if I'm catching this incorrectly, go ahead and throw it in the chat box, but brochures or other information to be giving to folks you're working with, how would they go about getting those from Emerge?
You can reach out to info@emergecenter.org. You can also get to that through our website, emergecenter.org, or we'll make sure my contact information is available as well, but which is another question I saw. So yes, certainly please feel free to reach out to us and me personally after this. But yeah, we've got brochures and posters and what we call wallet cards, which are business size little cards that talk about how to connect somebody to help. And the point of them being that size is that survivors can then hide them in places they might not be able to otherwise. They used to be called shoe cards because you can stick them under the insole of your shoe. People put them in their bra, they put them in all kinds of places, but they're meant to be easily hidden. And they also talk about helping someone else, even though it's really often meant for the survivor themselves, but it kind of throws off their partner if they find it to be able to have an out and say, no, I'm using, I had this to help my friend. So there's all kinds of resources like that we have available.
Thank you. And then we have a couple of questions about some specific populations. Questions are coming in related to resources that are available for men and their children who are in an abusive situation. Also a question about folks who may be undocumented in abusive situations. And lastly, about trans women.
Okay. I'll quickly try to touch on each. We serve all of the above. While we largely see it as male violence against women, it is not exclusively that by any means. And so, yes, we serve male victims, including when they have children with them. We provide shelter to male victims when they need it, not limited to women victims. We certainly serve folks who are transgender as well. And try to make sure that they drive the bus in terms of what is most comfortable for them in terms of service provision, including what shelter looks like. Again, we try to work closely with the anti-violence program at SAFE as well, if that feels more comfortable to those folks. We do serve undocumented victims. That is a piece that, thank goodness, is part of the Violence Against Women Act. That was originally crafted by now President Biden, but that many years ago was created on the federal level and includes a provision that not only says that we have to serve undocumented folks, thank goodness, but that there are certain protections for them, including special visas that they can obtain just because they are undocumented but experiencing domestic violence. And that's something that we can help get them connected to as an option if they want it. That is often, because we see a tactic that's often used, is that citizens who are abusive to non-citizen partners use that as a threat and as a manner of control, that, you know, if they're sponsoring their stay in this country and their visa process, they'll say they'll withdraw it. Well, this gives them a provision that allows them to self-petition. So there's those kind of things. We actually have an entire community-based office over at the El Pueblo Neighborhood Center on 6th and Irvington that almost exclusively serves the undocumented population. So there are definitely services available there.
Great, and I do see a few follow-up questions coming in here, and so we're going to hold on the two questions related to resources for homeless families and individuals, as well as if all parties are undocumented. We do have to wrap up here in just a few moments, and so one last question, and then I want to save time to give information for anyone who may need a training certificate and to provide feedback on the training today. So our last question then will be, what is the best way to connect participants to your services, Ed? And if they are to call and schedule an intake or use the website intake forms, about how long can organizations expect that there may be before there's a response to those types of requests?
Great question. The best way is always to call our hotline. 795-4266 is always the best way, because we can then kind of direct you and or the survivor into whatever path then is best. Shelter services are assessed in the moment. There's a lot of services that we can provide simply over the hotline on not only a one-time basis, but sometimes an ongoing basis. In terms of community-based services, that's where it tends to be a little bit more of a turnaround time, and it varies by moment what the volume's looking like. I will say it's sometimes 2 weeks or so, sometimes a little bit more to get people in for a first appointment and intake in the community-based. And from there, from community-based services or from our shelters, where we then tend to connect people with our housing program, if that's something that they want to pursue specifically. So the hotline is kind of the way to go. I will say we get, we're averaging about 23 calls a day right now on the hotline. There are times that unfortunately the hotline takes a moment to get through on. So just fair warning about that, but keep trying, please. Or you can certainly reach out in a pinch. And if you're ever, certainly as a service provider, if you're ever struggling to get somebody connected with services that emerge, you're not hearing back, or any of those kind of struggles, please email me directly, and I'm more than happy to look into the situation and try to make sure we can quickly get somebody connected.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ed. And if I know there have been a few mentions of emailing you directly, so if you'd be willing to share your email address in the chat box for folks. Thank you. This has been an incredible conversation. We do see there are a couple of lingering questions that we weren't able to get to today. So if you asked a question that you do not have an answer, you didn't get an answer for, please absolutely email Ed for more information. Thanks again to everyone for making time to come today. And I also want to make sure that folks are aware, we are happy to provide a training certificate for anyone who may need that for an employer. We know many of your organizations require this type of training. We're glad to provide that. And we also ask you to take a few minutes to fill out our training feedback form. That helps us improve the training that we're offering in the community. So we continue to bring great topics like this to you. So I have just posted links for both the feedback form and the certificate request. We do ask that you submit your certificate request no later than this Friday, and then we'll be able to get those out to you next week. And so someone is saying the forms do not exist, so give me a moment after I stop talking and I'll figure out what's happening right there. But then these forms will also be emailed out to you for everyone who attended today. As it relates to training certificates, we do want to let you know We provide training certificates for anyone who participates in the majority of the training. For today's training, we're considering that to be 70 minutes. So we will provide training certificates for anyone who is registered and has evidence in the training record of being present for 70 minutes. If you weren't here for that period of time, we encourage you to use our training site later to review the training again, and can get a training certificate at that time. Thank you so much.